The hug of death, close combat in Stalingrad in 1942, the Second World War stood at a pivotal juncture. Following the rapid conquest of Western Europe, Hitler's forces turned their sights eastward, launching Operation Barbarossa, the most extensive military invasion in recorded history. Millions of German soldiers surged into the Soviet Union, overwhelming its defenses and seizing vast areas of territory. The German war machine appeared invincible, carving a path of destruction through Soviet lands with a ferocity that left the world aghast. By the summer of 1942, Hitler's ambitions grew even more audacious. Germany's war effort was increasingly constrained by its reliance on oil, and the resource-rich Caucasus region became the focal point of his grand strategy. Yet, standing in the way of this prize was the city of Stalingrad, an industrial stronghold perched on the banks of the mighty Volga River. For Hitler, Stalingrad represented far more than a strategic objective. It was a symbol. Seizing the city that bore Stalin's name would deliver a humiliating blow to Soviet morale, while underscoring the supposed inevitability of German dominance. Furthermore, the capture of Stalingrad promised to sever vital railway connections and disrupt transport along the Volga, crippling Soviet industrial output, including its formidable tank production. For Stalin, however, the loss of Stalingrad was inconceivable. The city would be defended at any cost. In August 1942, the Luftwaffe reduced Stalingrad to ashes. Bombing raids devastated buildings, factories, and homes, transforming the once bustling city into a charred wasteland. Amid the ruins, a battle like no other began, where every street, building, and cellar became contested arena. Initially, German forces anticipated a swift victory amid the rubble. Instead, they encountered unyielding resistance and a level of ferocity for which they were wholly unprepared. Soviet defenders under the command of General Vasily Chuikov held their ground with an almost fanatical determination. Chuikov's tactics were as unorthodox as they were merciless. His soldiers engaged the enemy at such perilously close quarters that German artillery and air support were rendered ineffective. This approach, referred to as hugging the enemy, was not merely a measure of desperation, but a calculated strategy to nullify German advantages in firepower and mobility. It encapsulated the savage urban combat that came to define the Battle of Stalingrad and proved decisive in determining the course of the war on the Eastern Front. By August 1942, the German Sixth Army, under the command of General Friedrich Paulus, reached the outskirts of Stalingrad. Remarkably, the city itself had received only cursory mention in Case Blue, the German operational plan for the summer offensive. At this stage, the Wehrmacht appeared unstoppable, wielding the initiative with unchallenged dominance. The Red Army's position was perilous. Soviet defenses collapsed under the relentless German assault, and the Sixth Army advanced through the northern approaches to Stalingrad, capturing factories, rail yards, and other critical points. Soviet forces were driven back to the very banks of the Volga River, a natural boundary that served as both a lifeline and a death trap. The Volga became a scene of desperate improvisation. Supplies and reinforcements were ferried across its waters under constant bombardment from German artillery and the Luftwaffe. Many of these makeshift crossings ended in disaster, with boats destroyed before reaching the beleaguered Soviet defenders. Those who survived the crossing were immediately thrust into the fray, often with little preparation or respite. Amidst this maelstrom, General Vasily Chuikov assumed command of the 62nd Army. Chuikov quickly grasped that conventional tactics would be futile in the shattered landscape of Stalingrad. To defend the city, his troops would need to adapt to the brutal realities of urban warfare, fight their enemy at close quarters, and endure hardships beyond imagining. When Vasily Chuikov assumed command of the 62nd Army in September of 1942, the Soviet defenders were on the verge of collapse. Chuikov's headquarters was situated precariously on the west bank of the Volga River, perilously close to the front line. The situation was one of unrelenting chaos. German artillery and air raids pounded Soviet positions with merciless precision, leaving destruction in their wake. At one point, oil tanks struck by German bombs spilled rivers of burning oil into the trenches, creating scenes of unimaginable devastation. Communication lines were severed so frequently that Soviet high command often had no way of knowing whether Chuikov and his staff were still alive. The earth was scorched, the air thick with smoke, and the skies darkened by ash, as soldiers fought in an apocalyptic landscape. Across the Volga, Soviet artillery provided desperate support, but their fire had to be restrained. The proximity of German and Soviet troops left little margin for error. Chuikov quickly grasped the grim reality. The Red Army could not hope to match the Germans in open combat. The Wehrmacht's superior firepower, mobility, and coordination were overwhelming. To hold Stalingrad, the Soviets would need to redefine the terms of battle. Chuikov's solution was both daring and ruthless. He would force the Germans into a style of warfare for which they were neither trained nor equipped: close quarters combat. From his embattled headquarters, Chuikov issued a simple yet revolutionary directive. Soviet troops were to fight the enemy at point-blank range, sometimes within mere meters of their positions. The shattered urban landscape of Stalingrad made this feasible. Factories, basements, and the ruins of once proud buildings became arenas for knife fights, grenade skirmishes, and brutal hand-to-hand combat. The Germans, unaccustomed to such unrelenting and intimate conflict, referred to this urban nightmare as Ratenkrieg, or the War of Rats. For the Soviet defenders, the ruins of Stalingrad became a fortress. Every pile of rubble was transformed into a defensive position, every corner a potential ambush. German soldiers found themselves attacked from unexpected angles, from behind walls, beneath floorboards, or amidst the wreckage of factories. This method of warfare gave rise to what Chuikov termed hugging the enemy, a tactic that not only negated German superiority in tanks, artillery, and air support, but also inflicted a psychological toll on the invaders. It was a brutal, yet effective strategy, one that would come to define the battle for Stalingrad and play a crucial role in shifting the momentum of the Eastern Front. The hugging the enemy tactic emerged from sheer necessity. At its heart, it was a strategy of proximity, reducing the distance between opposing forces to mere meters or even less. In conventional warfare, the spacing between combatants dictated by trenches, artillery barrages, and open terrain typically range from 100 to 200 meters, enabling commanders to coordinate long-range firepower effectively. But the urban chaos of Stalingrad dismantled these norms entirely. Streets choked with debris, crumbling buildings and labyrinthine underground passages transformed the battlefield into a fragmented and intimate arena where conventional tactics faltered. By closing the gap, Soviet troops achieved three critical objectives: 1. Nullifying fire support. Artillery, tanks, and airstrikes, hallmarks of German superiority, became liabilities in close quarters. With Soviet soldiers maintaining such close proximity to enemy positions, German commanders faced an agonizing dilemma: use heavy weapons at the risk of striking their own troops, or engage in costly direct combat. Soviet fighters in effect turned themselves into human shields, compelling the Germans to fight on terms dictated by the defenders. 2. Forcing brutal, hand-to-hand combat. The Wehrmacht was adept at large-scale maneuver warfare and the integrated use of arms, but it was ill-prepared for the relentless demands of close combat. Soviet soldiers armed with submachine guns like the PPS-41, grenades, spades, and knives excelled in these engagements. Conversely, German troops, burdened by rifles and heavier equipment, struggled in this unforgiving environment where agility and ferocity often proved decisive. 3. Psychological warfare. The unremitting intimacy of the fighting exacted a heavy toll on the morale of German soldiers. They were assailed from every conceivable direction. Grenades hurled from basements, sniper fire from attics, and surprise attacks emerging from sewer tunnels. No position was secure. This grinding attrition, known to the Germans as Rettungskrieg, the War of the Rats, eroded their resolve and sapped their will to fight. Central to this form of combat was the PPS-41 submachine gun, a weapon that became synonymous with the Soviet soldier in Stalingrad. Its high rate of fire and reliability in close quarters made it devastatingly effective. Soviet troops would dash through bombed-out streets, closing the distance to German positions, and unleash a torrent of automatic fire and grenades. The fighting was savage and exacted an enormous toll on both sides. Soldiers clawed for control of individual rooms, basements, and staircases in a protracted struggle where victory was measured in inches. General Vasily Shukov, who orchestrated the defense, encapsulated the essence of this strategy when he said, quote, "We hold the enemy by the belt. This way they cannot destroy us with their artillery or aircraft." End quote. The tactic demanded extraordinary courage and ruthlessness from Soviet soldiers. It wasn't a battle of precision or conventional strategy. It was a battle for survival. By hugging the Germans, the Red Army turned the ruins of Stalingrad into an equalizing force. The Wehrmacht's technological and operational advantages were neutralized amid the rubble, while the indomitable will of the Soviet defenders began to shift the tide of the battle. The brutal reality of hugging the enemy played out relentlessly across Stalingrad, transforming entire districts, buildings, and even the sewers into deadly battlegrounds. This was not merely warfare. It was survival distilled into its most raw and visceral form. Every soldier, every squad fought tenaciously for their lives, advancing or retreating by mere inches. One of the most enduring examples of this strategy was the defense of Pavlov's house, a modest four-story apartment block that overlooked a critical square. Under the leadership of Sergeant Yakov Pavlov, this unassuming structure was turned into an unyielding fortress. Pavlov and his men barricaded windows with sandbags, set up machine guns to cover every approach, and stationed snipers in concealed vantage points. Daily German assaults, often combining infantry and tanks, were met with fierce resistance. The defenders relied on grenades, submachine guns, and close-range fire to repel the attackers. At times, the fighting grew so intense that soldiers battled within the same rooms, separated only by crumbling walls or doorways. A German officer later described Pavlov's house as a fortress with steel walls. In truth, its resilience was due to Chukov's strategy by forcing the Germans into close-quarters combat. The defenders rendered artillery and air support all but useless. The Germans couldn't destroy the building without endangering their own troops. Pavlov's men endured relentless bombardment, hunger, and bitter cold, but their ability to hug the enemy proved decisive in holding this crucial position. Another grim chapter unfolded at the Red October factory, an industrial complex that became a microcosm of the entire battle for Stalingrad. Once a center of Soviet production, the factory was reduced to a chaotic expanse of rubble, where Soviet and German soldiers fought over individual machines, stairwells, and catwalks. In some cases, a single room changed hands multiple times in a single day. The intimacy of the fighting bred brutal ingenuity. Soviet troops threw grenades through holes in walls or floors, ambushed German squads from the basements, and launched attacks via the city's sewer system. This subterranean combat added a new layer of terror for German soldiers, who described the sewers as hellish labyrinths, where the enemy seemed to materialize from the shadow. Amid this urban carnage, Soviet sniper Vasily Zaitsev rose to legendary status. Exploiting the devastated landscape, Zaitsev and his fellow snipers stalked German positions. Camouflaged amid the rubble, their work embodied Chuikov's strategy, fighting so close to the Germans that counter-sniper fire or artillery was rendered ineffective. Reflecting on his deadly craft, Zaitsev remarked, quote, "We snipers had to get as close as possible. In this city, it was like hunting in a forest of stone." End quote. For the Germans, the psychological toll of such warfare was immense. One soldier wrote despairingly, quote, "The Russians were everywhere. You couldn't see them, but you could feel them breathing down your neck." End quote. The hugging the enemy tactic transformed Stalingrad into a grinding attritional struggle that devoured the German Sixth Army. What had begun as a campaign of swift conquest devolved into a nightmarish quagmire. The ruins of Stalingrad negated the Wehrmacht's firepower and technological edge, forcing the Germans into the very type of warfare they were at least equipped to fight. More than a tactic, hugging the enemy became a declaration of defiance. For every inch of ground, Soviet soldiers sent a message to their adversaries: "We will fight you wherever you are, no matter the cost." The hugging the enemy tactic wasn't just a desperate measure in Stalingrad. It revealed a truth about warfare that still applies today. Sometimes close combat can neutralize even the most advanced firepower. In modern conflicts, technology dominates the battlefield. Drones, precision airstrikes, and artillery allow armies to destroy enemies from miles away. However, hugging the enemy remains relevant, especially in urban warfare, where combatants fight for control of cities and buildings. For example, in the Vietnam War, the Viet Cong often engaged American forces at extremely close range, knowing that us air support and artillery wouldn't fire for fear of hitting their own troops. Similarly, during battles in cities like Fallujah in the Iraq War, close quarters combat forced technologically advanced militaries to rely on infantry instead of overwhelming firepower. However, hugging the enemy comes with a cost. Modern soldiers are better equipped with night vision, body armor, and close combat weapons. But urban warfare remains incredibly bloody and destructive. Victory often comes at the price of heavy casualties and the complete devastation of cities. The Battle of Stalingrad showed how proximity could level the playing field against a superior enemy. It was a brutal, high-risk tactic that turned German strengths, like tanks, artillery, and air power, into weaknesses. For Vasily Chuikov and the Red Army, hugging the enemy wasn't just a strategy, it was the only way to survive.